Imagine stepping out of your front door on a crisp autumn afternoon. The air smells of pine and damp earth. The leaves are a brilliant tapestry of crimson and gold, and you are just a few hundred yards from a well-traveled trail. You take a breath, walk into the woods, and simply cease to exist. No tracks, no dropped keys, no struggle. You don't just disappear. It's as if the universe itself reached down, blinked, and erased you from the canvas of reality. For the next few hours, we are going inside one of the most chilling, documented, and fiercely protected secrets in American history. This isn't a campfire ghost story. This is the meticulously recorded, deeply unsettling reality of the Bennington Triangle, a dense, suffocating stretch of wilderness in southwestern Vermont that, between 1945 and 1950, swallowed human beings whole, leaving the FBI, local militia, and the nation's best trackers utterly humiliated. Grab your coffee, settle into your favorite chair, and let's go back to a time when America was celebrating the end of World War II, yet looking over its shoulder at the shadows in its own backyard. The man who walked into the fog. Our story begins on November 12th, 1945. The world was finally breathing a sigh of relief. The war was over, the boys were coming home, and the rugged, fiercely independent state of Vermont was preparing for the hunting season. Among those looking forward to the quiet camaraderie of the woods was a 74-year-old man named Mitty Rivers. Now, Mitty wasn't a tourist. He wasn't some city slicker from New York who got confused by a map. Mitty Rivers was a seasoned, tough-as-leather hunting guide. He knew the Green Mountains like the back of his weathered hands. He knew which ridges caught the early morning sun, which streams were safe to drink from, and exactly how the weather could turn on a dime. If anyone belonged in these woods, it was Mitty. On that chilly Monday morning, Mitty was leading a group of 4 hunters through the area known as Gladdenfury. An old abandoned logging patch near the base of Glastonbury Mountain. The air was heavy, the kind of damp cold that gets into your bones. Around noon, the group was walking back toward the main road. Mitty, being the guide, was slightly ahead of the rest. He turned to his companions, gave them a reassuring nod, and said he was going to walk just a little bit faster to get to the camp and start the fire. He stepped around a sharp bend in the trail surrounded by a thick stand of hemlock trees. He was out of their sight for less than 60 seconds. When the rest of the hunting party rounded that exact same bend, the trail was empty. The forest was dead silent. No snapping twigs, no heavy footsteps in the brush. Just the wind whistling through the pines. "Mitty," they called out. Nothing. They laughed at first, thinking the old man was playing a prank. But as the minutes ticked by and the silence stretched, unease turned into cold, sharp panic. They hurried to the camp. No fire was lit. Mitty's gear was exactly where he had left it that morning. By the next day, the search was no longer a casual look around. Over 300 people, local volunteers, state police, and hardened woodsmen combed every square inch of Gladdenfury. They brought tracking dogs. They brought lanterns. They stayed out until their hands were numb. And this is where the first detail emerges that baffled the authorities. The dogs. When the bloodhounds were brought to the exact spot where Mitty vanished, they didn't catch a scent that led off into the brush. Instead, the dogs walked to the bend in the trail, suddenly stopped, whined, and lay down on the frozen ground. They refused to move. It was as if the scent trail didn't go left, right, or forward. It just stopped. An 8-day search yielded absolutely nothing. Not a shred of clothing, not a single footprint in the mud, not a dropped matchbook. Mitty Rivers, a master of the wilderness, had vanished into thin air. The locals whispered about the old Native American legends of Glastonbury Mountain, stories told by the Algonquins, who warned that the mountain was cursed, a place where the wind blew from all four directions at once, and where a mysterious stone that swallows men lay hidden in the brush. But in 1945, modern Americans didn't believe in curses. They believed in logic, tracking, and evidence. Yet logic had failed them completely. Little did they know, Mitty Rivers was only the prologue. The disappearance of Paula Weldon. If the vanishing of an elderly guide could be chalked up to a sudden medical emergency, or an accidental fall into an unmarked logging shaft, what happened 1 year later, in December of 1946, shook the entire United States to its core. This is the case that changed Vermont forever, leading directly to the creation of the Vermont State Police. Paula Jean Weldon was 18 years old. She was a sophomore at Bennington College, an elite progressive art school nestled at the base of the mountains. Paula was the eldest daughter of W. Archibald Weldon, a wealthy, well-known industrial designer from Stamford, Connecticut. She was bright, artistic, popular, and an avid outdoors woman. On Sunday, December 1st, 1946, Paula decided she needed a break from her studies. It was a beautiful, crisp afternoon, though the forecast warned of snow later in the evening. She dressed in a distinctive bright red Hartford-style parka, blue jeans, and white sneakers. She didn't take a backpack, money, or extra clothing. She was just going for a brisk walk on the famous Long Trail, a rugged 272-mile hiking trail that cuts through Vermont. Several people saw Paula that afternoon. She hitched a ride from a local contractor named Lewis Knapp, who drove her as far as State Route 9, right near the entrance to the trail. Around 4 p.m., an elderly couple, Danny and Ernest Bump, saw her walking on the trail itself. They spoke briefly. They warned her that the sun was dipping below the ridge. The temperature was dropping fast, and she wasn't dressed for a winter night on the mountain. Paula smiled, thanked them, and turned a corner on the trail, heading north toward Glastonbury. That was the last time anyone ever saw Paula Weldon alive. When Paula didn't return to her dorm for dinner, her roommate didn't worry immediately. Bennington girls were independent, but by Monday morning when she missed her classes, the college administration called her father. What followed was one of the most agonizing, poorly managed, and massive search efforts in New England history. You see, in 1946, Vermont had no state police force. They relied on local county sheriffs who had little training in wilderness search and rescue. Paula's father rushed to Vermont, offering a massive reward. Over 500 people descended on the Long Trail. The military sent airplanes equipped with early aerial photography. Even students from Bennington College linked hands, walking through the dense brush, calling Paula's name until their throats were raw. The searchers found plenty of clues, but none of them made sense. A waitress in a nearby town claimed she served a girl matching Paula's description. A cabin owner reported seeing a young woman in a red coat running into the woods. Bloodhounds were brought in again. And just like with Mitty Rivers, the dogs tracked her scent to a specific point on the trail, stopped dead in their tracks, and began howling at the gray sky. Days turned into weeks. The snow fell, covering the mountains in a thick, white shroud. The search was called off, but the mystery only grew darker. The FBI, under J. Edgar Hoover, stepped in to investigate the possibility of a kidnapping. They looked into her father, her boyfriend, and local drifters. Every lead turned into a dead end. The brilliant red coat Paula wore should have stuck out like a beacon against the stark, gray and white winter forest. Yet not a single thread of that red coat was ever found. The grief-stricken Archibald Weldon publicly blasted the state of Vermont for its lack of a centralized law enforcement agency, stating that his daughter's life might have been saved if professionals had handled the case. Out of shame and necessity, the Vermont legislature officially formed the Vermont State Police the very next year, in 1947. But even a new police force couldn't stop what was waiting in the mountains. The veteran who vanished from the moving bus. If you are looking for the most truly bizarre, logically impossible event in this entire saga, we must fast forward to December 1st, 1949, exactly 3 years to the day after Paula Weldon vanished. James E. Tedford was a 68-year-old military veteran. He was a man of routine, quiet, and disciplined. On that late autumn day, Tedford boarded a Greyhound bus in St. Albans, Vermont, heading home to Bennington after visiting family. The bus journey was long but completely ordinary. There were about 14 other passengers on board. Several of them noted Tedford sitting toward the back of the bus. He was a recognizable figure, a polite older gentleman wearing a heavy coat, carrying a small piece of luggage, and holding a bus schedule in his hands. As the bus rumbled south through the cold Vermont landscape, Tedford was seen sleeping in his seat. The bus made no unscheduled stops. The doors remained shut between the designated stations. As the bus finally pulled into the Bennington terminal, the driver announced the arrival. The passengers began gathering their coats and bags, but the seat in the back was empty. James Tedford was gone. Now let's think about this logically. This wasn't a crowded subway, it was a moving bus. The passengers confirmed he was there at the last stop before Bennington, yet when the bus arrived, he wasn't on it. The investigators were completely dumbfounded. Did he jump out of a moving bus window? No windows were open, and the freezing wind would have alerted everyone. Did he slip out at a stop? The passengers who sat near him swore he never stood up. When the police searched the empty seat, they found something that sent shivers down their spines. Tedford's luggage was still resting in the rack above his head, and on the empty seat, where he'd been sleeping just an hour prior, lay his open bus schedule. James Tedford had vanished from inside a moving vehicle, leaving his earthly belongings behind. He was never seen or heard from again. To this day, the case file remains open, a chilling testament to the fact that whatever was happening in the Bennington Triangle wasn't just confined to the lonely trails of the woods. The pattern solidifies. By 1950, a sense of dread hung over the towns surrounding Glastonbury Mountain, Bennington, Woodford, and Shaftesbury. People stopped locking their doors just against thieves. They locked them against the unknown. Parents refused to let their children play near the tree lines. The woods, once a source of pride and livelihood for Vermonters, had become a looming, malevolent presence. And then the mountain took a child. On October 12, 1950, 8-year-old Paul Jeffson was riding in a pickup truck with his mother. They had driven up to a dump site near the mountain. The sun was out, and it was a normal Thursday afternoon. Mrs. Jeffson got out of the truck to tend to some chores, leaving young Paul playing happily in the truck bed. She told him she would be gone for just a few minutes. She walked no more than 100 feet away. When she returned, the truck bed was empty. She screamed his name. She ran to the edge of the woods, her heart pounding. Nothing answered but the rustle of the wind. Because of the previous high-profile disappearances, the response was immediate and massive. Within hours, hundreds of law enforcement officers, military personnel, and volunteers formed a human chain. They searched with a desperation never seen before. They knew the clock was ticking for an 8-year-old boy, in the dropping autumn temperatures. The sheriff brought in the best tracking hounds available. This time the dogs did find a scent. They caught the little boy's trail and led the search party straight toward the mountain, running with purpose. The searchers felt a surge of hope they were going to find him. But then the trail took a bizarre turn. The dogs led the handlers directly to a local highway, the exact same stretch of Route 9 where Paula Weldon had been seen years earlier. At that road, the dogs stopped, sat down, and lost the scent entirely. The sheriff was baffled. Had the boy been snatched by a motorist? If so, how did it happen? In the few minutes his mother was gone, on a remote road with almost no traffic. What makes Paul Jeffson's case even more mysterious is what his father told the newspapers days later. He said that for weeks before his disappearance, little Paul had been talking about a strange, irresistible urge to go into the mountains. He had expressed a sudden, uncharacteristic fascination with the deep woods of Glastonbury, the unending Echo 4 cases, all within a tiny, specific geographic radius, all occurring between the months of October and December, all involving victims who left absolutely zero trace. No blood, no struggle, no items of clothing, and scents that evaporated into nothingness. Over the decades, theories have run rampant. Some blame a highly sophisticated, localized serial killer, a phantom of the woods who knew how to evade trackers and cover his tracks perfectly. Others point to the strange magnetic anomalies discovered in the Green Mountains, suggesting that perhaps the unique geology causes electronic and geographical disorientation, leading people to fall into hidden, deep geological fissures that act as natural tombs. And then, of course, there are the ancient legends. The stories of the Bennington monster, a creature said to inhabit the high ridges, or the Algonquin warnings of a patch of ground that breaks the rules of time and space. We may never know what truly lies within the heart of the Bennington Triangle. The trees have grown taller, the old logging trails have been reclaimed by moss and ferns, and the silence of Glastonbury Mountain remains unbroken. But one thing is certain. For those who know the history, a walk in the beautiful Vermont woods will never feel entirely safe again. Because sometimes history isn't just something we read, it's something that watches us from the shadows of the pines, waiting for the perfect moment to make us a part of it. The final vanishing and the grasp of the mountain. The autumn of 1950 refused to let go of its dark grip on Bennington. The search for young Paul Jeffson had barely been officially called off when the mountain demanded another soul. This time, the tragedy would break the pattern of age and gender, leaving investigators to wonder if the wilderness itself had a conscious, insatiable hunger. It was October 28, 1950, just 16 days after the Jeffson boy vanished. The weather was unusually warm for late October, a phenomena New Englanders call Indian summer. Frida Langer, a 53-year-old experienced hiker, survivalist, and devoted mother, decided to take advantage of the beautiful afternoon. Frida was not a stranger to the rugged terrain. She and her cousin, Herbert Elsner, were exploring a heavily wooded area near the Somerset Reservoir, a massive body of water sitting right at the eastern spine of Glastonbury Mountain. They had set up a base camp and were navigating a trail they had walked dozens of times before. Around 3:45 p.m., as they neared the edge of the reservoir, Frida slipped. It wasn't a dramatic fall, but she landed squarely in a deep, muddy stream, soaking her boots and trousers up to the knee. She laughed it off, looked at Herbert, and said, "Keep going ahead. I'm going to run back to the camp, change into dry clothes, and catch up with you in 15 minutes. Herbert nodded, checked his watch, and continued down the trail. He knew the camp was less than a quarter-mile behind them on a clear, wide path. Frida was strong, fast, and light on her feet. Herbert walked for a bit, then sat on a log to wait. 15 minutes passed, then 30. The warmth of the afternoon began to fade, replaced by that sharp, sudden chill that hits the Vermont woods the moment the sun drops behind the high ridges. By 4:45 p.m., an hour had gone by. Herbert, now deeply unsettled, jogged back to the camp. When he broke through the tree line into the clearing, he expected to see Frida sitting by the tent, perhaps drying her boots by a fire. Instead, the camp was dead silent. Her dry clothes were still neatly folded inside the tent. Her husband, who had stayed behind at the camp to rest, was fast asleep. He hadn't heard a sound. Frida Langer had never made it back to the camp. Think about the physics of this specific moment. She vanished on a straight, clear path of less than 400 yards, nestled between her cousin ahead and her husband behind. She was trapped in a tiny corridor of time and space. What makes Frida's case stand out from Mitty, Rivers, Paula Weldon, and James Tedford is the sheer scale of the response. The state of Vermont, utterly embarrassed by the previous failures, pulled out all the stops. This wasn't just a search. It was a military operation. Over the next 2 weeks, the Somerset wilderness was invaded by over 300 searchers, including the U.S. Army, local citizens, aircraft from the Civil Air Patrol, and elite tracking teams from neighboring states. They didn't just walk the trails, they cleared brush, dragged the freezing depths of the Somerset Reservoir, and used helicopters equipped with searchlights. They found nothing. No footprints in the mud where she slipped. No broken branches, no dropped items. The mountain had pulled its classic terrifying trick, complete and utter evaporation. But then the story of Frida Langer takes a twist that separates it from every other disappearance in the Bennington Triangle, a twist that leaves more questions than answers. 6 months later, in May of 1951, the winter snows finally melted from the peaks of the Green Mountains. A group of local fishermen were walking near a small, swampy outlet of the Somerset Reservoir, an area that had been meticulously combed, foot by foot, by hundreds of soldiers and dogs just months prior. There, lying in the open, was the body of Frida Langer. The state line was immediately cordoned off. The coroner rushed to the scene, but instead of providing answers, the discovery opened a gateway into a deeper mystery. Frida's body was severely decomposed, but her clothes were completely intact, the same clothes she had gone missing in. However, because of the condition of the remains, the medical examiner was utterly unable to determine the cause of death. There were no broken bones, no signs of gunshot wounds, no evidence of a struggle, and no signs of animal scavenging, which in itself was miraculous for a body left in the wilderness for 6 months. But the real puzzle was the location. The search teams from November swore on their lives that they had searched that exact swampy clearing dozens of times. A body in a bright jacket would have been impossible to miss. It was as if Frida Langer had been taken somewhere else, somewhere outside our reality, and then dropped back onto the earth months after the search had died down. She remains the only victim ever returned by the Triangle, and she took her secrets to the grave. The anatomy of the Triangle. After Frida Langer, the sudden burst of disappearances stopped as abruptly as it had begun. 5 people in 5 years. The curtain had closed, but the psychological scars on the community of Bennington remained raw. To understand why this happened, we have to look past the newspaper headlines and look at the strange, forgotten archives of the region. It was during the late 1950s that researchers, folklorists, and geologists began to realize that Bennington was sitting on top of something deeply anomalous. First, let's look at the geography. The term Bennington Triangle was actually coined much later by the famous Vermont author and folklorist Joseph A. Citro. He noticed that if you draw a line connecting the towns of Bennington, Woodford, and Shaftesbury, with Glastonbury Mountain sitting dead in the center, you get a perfect geographical pocket of high strangeness. But long before Joseph Citro, the Native Americans knew, the local Algonquin tribes refused to settle on Glastonbury Mountain. They viewed it as a dark, heavy place where the natural laws didn't apply. According to their oral histories, they used the mountain only as a burial ground, believing it was inhabited by a binding wind that could steal a man's soul and make him wander in circles until he died of starvation. They warned early European settlers never to sleep on its slopes. The settlers, of course, didn't listen. In the 19th century, Glastonbury was turned into a bustling logging hub. The town of Fayetteville was built high up on the mountain, complete with homes, a school, and a massive sawmill. But the mountain seemed to reject civilization. The logging industry collapsed overnight. Violent and unexplained murders occurred among the loggers, and by the turn of the century, Fayetteville was a ghost town, swallowed back up by the creeping vines and hemlocks. But for the 50-plus generation listening to this, you know that folklore only goes so far. What about the science? Geologists have noted that the Green Mountains are among the oldest geological formations on Earth, much older than the Rockies or the Alps. They are rich in quartz deposits and magnetic minerals. For decades, hikers on the Long Trail have reported that their compasses fluctuate wildly near the peak of Glastonbury. The needles spin, uselessly pointing toward invisible magnetic hubs. Could this severe magnetic anomaly cause a form of sudden, acute geographical disorientation? Imagine walking a trail, your inner ear and your compass suddenly failing simultaneously, causing you to step off the path and fall into one of the hundreds of abandoned, hidden vertical logging shafts that riddle the mountain like Swiss cheese. It is a logical, comforting theory, but it fails to explain how James Tedford vanished from a moving bus, or how an 8-year-old boy vanished from the back of a truck in the span of 3 minutes. The shadow of the phantom. There is one final chilling theory that began to circulate among retired Vermont State Police detectives in the late 1960s. It's a theory that doesn't involve monsters, portals, or ancient curses, but something far more terrifying, because it wears a human face. The timeline of the Bennington Triangle, 1945 to 1950, perfectly matches the operational window of what modern criminologists call a high-functioning wilderness predator. Think about it. The victims ranged from an old man to a young college girl, an older veteran, a young child, and a middle-aged woman. To a traditional serial killer, this lack of a victim profile makes no sense. But to a predator who is motivated purely by the thrill of the hunt in a challenging environment, the Bennington Triangle was the perfect playground. Imagine a person, perhaps a local resident, a war veteran with elite tracking skills, or a mountain hermit who knew every hidden cave, every abandoned cabin, and every blind spot on the long trail. A person who watched through binoculars as Paula Weldon walked in her bright red coat. A person who knew exactly how long it took a woman to change her muddy clothes at a campsite. This phantom could have snatched these people with absolute precision, utilizing the heavy fog and the dense brush to mask the sounds of a struggle, disposing of them in places where the law could never look. But even this dark theory leaves us in the dark. How could one man pull off the disappearance of James Tedford from a bus full of witnesses? How could he evade the army dogs that lost the scent at the exact same spot on the highway? The silent woods today. Route 9 still winds through the mountains, connecting Bennington to the rest of Vermont. If you drive it during a gray, late autumn afternoon, when the fog rolls off the reservoir and blankets the road, you can still feel the weight of those 5 missing years.